The veneer of civilization, as Thucydides said, is always very thin because human nature is unchanging. So when I wrote the collated from the historian Appian and parts of Livy, that gruesome scene on the walls where they cut off the ears and disemboweled, cut up and mutilated these Roman soldiers. There's a lot of barbarity in the ancient world, but that was one of the most graphic scenes. But when I read and I looked at some of the videos from Hamas, two things struck me. One, I had never seen in the modern world that level of mutilation or gang rape or sickness, putting a child in a microwave, for example. And I'd never seen such indifference to it. So here we are 8 months later, and the people on the campus don't even mention it. And not only do they not mention it, they were cheering it on after it happened. As I said, a number of professors have been put on leave for saying things like they were exhilarated. And this was the beginning of the Free Palestine movement. We're always just a hair's breadth from what we really are, which is pretty savage without civilization.
My guest on this occasion is, once again, Victor Davis Hanson. I don't think I know of anyone who offers deeper insights into the challenges facing America and indeed the West and the world more generally than Victor. He's the Martin and Illie Anderson Senior Fellow in Residence in Classics and Military History at the Hoover Institution, Stanford, California. He's written many books on ancient and modern warfare. He understands that human nature doesn't change and there's much to be learnt from history. His latest book, just released, is The End of Everything: How Wars Descend Into Annihilation. And we'll turn to that after we've talked about the current state of American politics and the dangers of the Middle East as they present at the moment. Victor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, John.
I can't help thinking that with the benefit of a bit of hindsight, a lot of what is now happening, the divisions really come from President Obama's era. You know, somebody who really could have reached disadvantaged America, could have reached broken African American families, could have played a constructive role in heading off movements like Black Lives Matter, but somehow seems to have been more captive of the East and West Coast white elites.
Yes, certainly I've written that a lot of the emphasis on tribal identity was reintroduced by the Obama administration, and they were the ones that gave us diversity, that term. Instead of the old black-white binary, they redefined American demography as anybody who wasn't white suddenly was part of a 30 or 35% tribal antithesis, and then they had claims against the majority instead of a Marxist binary of, you know, oppressor, oppressed, victim, victimizer. That came with Obama.
Victor, it appears that most of the polls have Trump convincingly ahead of Biden as preferred president. That may well narrow in the lead up to the election, and it may very well be influenced by the never-ending lawfare. But in your view, as we sit here now, some months out, with this election that is so critical for America and the rest of the world, what are you thinking will decide this election? Will it basically come out down to who can get their hardcore supporters out? And what role might RFK, Mr. Kennedy, play in it all?
Yeah. There's about 4 or 5 deciding points. One of them, of course, is the third party. Third parties never win, but they, as we learned in the case of George H.W. Bush in 1992, and then of course he ran, Ross Perot ran again in 96, and he may have affected that second election. Bill Clinton won 2 terms without winning 50% of the vote. So this time we've got Jill Stein, who could get 1 or 2%, Cornel West, who could get 1 or 2%, and RFK Jr., who could get maybe 9 to 15%. And the problem the Biden administration has is that all of those people are identified with the left. RFK is more so than he was earlier. He's identifying more and more with the left, and he's trying to make a deal with Biden that one of them would drop out. So that's going to hurt, I think, as the cycle wears on. It's going to hurt Biden, and it shows up in the polls where suddenly this 1 or 2 point difference in the national polls has expanded to 6 to 10, depending on the particular poll. And then in the key swing states that will determine the Electoral College, Trump is usually ahead in all of them, and maybe even in Pennsylvania. So that's one thing. And then, of course, getting out the vote, we went into a revolutionary cycle that you and I have talked about, where suddenly in 2020, 70% of the people didn't vote on election day with an ID. They voted through mail and early balloting. And that favors the Democrats. And because they control the big cities, they control the balloting, they raised over $1 billion to supplant the work of the registrars in some key states. That's something that will determine if the Republicans can, in swing states, get 40 or 50% to vote actually on election day. And the other thing that no one knows, John, is that in these big cities, Pittsburgh, in the swing states, Philadelphia, Detroit, Tucson, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Reno, Atlanta. There's a lot of, these tend to be majority states in some cases. And unlike 2020, there's now polls that show 25% of the African American vote, as much as 50% of the so-called Hispanic vote might go Trump. And those are precisely the people who are in those big cities in positions of voter responsibility as far as the balloting goes. And so you might have a lot of eyes and ears that you didn't have in 2020 that are invested more to make sure that Donald Trump has a transparent balloting count than you did in 2020. The other big thing is the known unknowns is these riots, unlike the 2020 that went on for 4 months. You don't hear Kamala Harris this time around saying these riots are not going to stop, these demonstrations are not going to stop, they shouldn't stop, they're going to go all the election, because unlike 2020, the end party is not antithetical to the protesters. So Donald Trump was trying to stop them, and he said, these are left-wing protests, and the left came back to him, as Joe Biden famously remarked, and said, you're the president is responsible no matter what. Well, now it's very different that the end party, the protesters are on their side. So there's nobody saying there's a bunch of right-wing people that Biden can't control. They're saying, these are your people. These are the people you empathize with, unlike 2020 when they were protesting against Trump, and now it's your responsibility. So we don't know what's going to happen, because school is going to be out in a week or two, and it's going to be out, I think the Israelis are sort of timing their entry into Gaza on the expectation that Western campuses will be shut down for summer break, and they won't have the same degree of influence, the protesters, on the governments as they do now. But we don't know if that's true. So we'll see if these protests can rekindle when there's not an open student body in residence at these campuses. And then we don't know finally what the situation will be with Donald Trump. He's only halfway through 2 of 4, so he still has a rendezvous with Fani Willis and Jack Smith. And we don't know whether the sheer outrageousness of the prosecutors, and they're not doing very well in court, but they're in blue cities with blue judges and blue juries and blue prosecutors. So we don't know what will be the ultimate effect. Right now, we do know that it is helping Donald Trump, and people are outraged at this miscarriage of justice, but we don't know if he should be jailed, taken off the campaign trail, psychologically, physically exhausted, subject to gag orders or even jailing. What will be the effect on the swing voters? Will they say, oh my God, this is terrible what they're doing to him, I'm going to vote for Biden? Or it's terrible what they're doing to him, but my God, he's the president. I can't vote for a president in jail. We've never done that before. So that's a known unknown. We just don't know what the reaction is going to be by November.
It's stating, I suppose, the bleeding obvious, but the rest of the world looks on and thinks, how on earth did America come to this? The thing people say to me all the time is, how ever did a country of America's standing and prestige and what have you, 300 million people, come to this point? A variation on this that I hadn't thought of until I was talking to Dave Rubin a little while ago was that of the, we see the splits, the city versus city, the East Coast versus and West Coast versus the inland, those with degrees, those who don't have degrees, those sorts of splits. And then you see the political split. But there's another one I'd be interested in your views on that Dave Rubin referred to. It's that you have blue states and red states, my words, not his, almost becoming principalities in their own right. So California is becoming, it's an enormous economy even today. And a lot of people, it's bigger than a lot of European countries, but it's completely and absolutely different to a Florida.
Yes.
And it seems to be another sort of massive set of fault lines in America. You're almost seeing the emergence of principalities. In a way, that's, I suppose, gives the American people choice, but does it take you further down the road to the smashing of American identity?
Yeah, I think we here in this country pride ourselves in the federal system where we have these semi-autonomous states that can develop their own culture and traditions, laws, customs. And we feel that that's sort of a safety valve, that when the federal government gets oppressive or tries to be too uniform, a state can reestablish its secular traditional identity. But we don't realize that there's been times in American history where the sheer semi-autonomous nature of states and the freedom to travel and to move have given a self-selecting or force multiplying effect to national differences. We saw that in the 1850s. It wasn't so much moving as there was a group of southern states, 11 of them, on the issue of slavery led to the Civil War. What we're seeing now is about 4 to 6 million people moving, and almost 90% of them are moving in one direction from a blue state, Illinois, New York, California, Minnesota, Michigan, to a red state. And it's massive. And the red states have an entirely different code of laws as they pertain to abortion, guns. They have cultural differences on religion, on the traditions of the United States, military service, et cetera, et cetera. And there's an adjudicator, there's a third party reality, and that is the red states are not insolvent. They are working. They do not have a problem with big city prosecutors. Their campuses, for the most part, are quiet. The city councils in red cities, the mayors and the governors of red states will not tolerate what we're seeing at Stanford University, where I work, or Princeton, or Yale, or Columbia, or Chicago, all of these big blue cities where our blue chip universities are. So this is an accelerant of a kind of a strange and maybe even dangerous trend that the country is bifurcating. You could make the argument that Tennessee feels closer to Florida, to Arizona, to Texas than they do, much closer than Illinois or California. But what I'm getting at is maybe more close and with more affinity with each other than they do the United States, and vice versa with the blue states.
Yeah.
And it's something has geopolitical ramifications if that were to be true. It's a very delicate thing, John. When you have Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and you have Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, and out of the blue in 2021, they say there's a vast white supremacist clique in the aftermath of George Floyd that they're going to root out. And this is sort of a clinger, deplorable, irredeemable, supposed subset. And you implement DEI, which is a non-meritocratic methodology of retention, promotion, advancement in the military. And then you tell the same demographic of white males from the rural and South, lower middle class, that we're going to get you, even if you've had COVID 2 or 3 times, you're going to be out of the military if you don't vaccinate. Well, 8,500 of them, of our best, left. And then we're short 45,000 soldiers. It's never happened before. And if you look at the demographics of the enlistment, they're not Hispanics who are enlisting at the same numbers blacks are, gays, women, etc. They're almost entirely, the shortfalls are off on the very demographic that died at twice the numbers in the general population in Iraq and Afghanistan, where 75% roughly of all the deaths were lower class, middle class, suburban class, white males, inordinately from red states. And they only represent white males in general, about 33% of the population, yet they died. And yet that's the very demographic that the Army went after. And now all of a sudden, with the Afghanistan humiliation and Gaza, Ukraine, the Chinese balloon, the military is in full panic. So gone are the commercials of pregnant women in flight suits and George Floyd motifs for recruitment, and suddenly it's a bunch of guys that look like they're World War II vets jumping out of helicopters or storming the beaches, and the commercial says, "Be all you can be, defend your country," and this is a direct appeal to that lost constituency that they alienated. So, John, all of these differences that we have in culture and politics and economics and their view of America, red versus blue, are starting to manifest themselves in this election year. And they're not compatible. And some of them are existential when you start to deal with a military that, as I said, Ukraine, Afghanistan humiliation, the Gaza war, China threatening Taiwan. And then you look at the military, you see that it's not really equipped to replenish its massive airlifts to Israel and Ukraine. But more importantly, it's short of the very type of soldiers who volunteer to go fight in god-awful places like Kandahar or Fallujah or Mosul. And we're not getting those soldiers. And so the question arises, what's going to happen? And we're also borrowing every 100 days, we're borrowing $1 trillion under the Biden administration. So we're very worried here about a lot of things they're going to come to an apex during this election.
There's a little subset of that. I was talking to a young Australian who recently applied to the military here, and the recruiter opened up and told him that those new recruitment techniques in America, where they appeal to traditional values, as you said, they, put up imagery of traditional brave American fighting men rather than appealing to the sort of modern mindset, have actually been highly effective. And they do produce surges in recruits of the sort of people you want in the military in America, as I would imagine, and as I think you would see it. And that, in fact, it's even being considered here in Australia, where we have the same problem with attracting good people and then retaining them. It's a good pointer, I think, as to how mad the world has gone, that we're reverting to an old age and we're attracting the best and most capable young people to defend us.
It is. And when I watched the testimony of our 4-star generals, I thought, wow, they're committing suicide in their institution because they're making unfounded charges and they're implementing new protocols that are directly aimed at a supposedly biased young 18 to 20-year-old who has never had much of an opportunity in this country. They were the losers of globalization in the Midwest and the South, rural people. And yet we know from their statistics and their battlefield efficacy that these are the very people that our enemies are afraid of. These are the people we send into the streets of Baghdad. These are the people we send in, to Kabul, and they're very good soldiers. They're the world's best. And yet why you would tamper with that, it makes no sense. It's the same thing on the other end of the spectrum on these campuses. These were the world's most preeminent campuses. 1/3, roughly, of all the students are foreign students, the million students. We have 1 million foreign students that come in here to study at these preeminent universities. But if you look at what they've done, they have dropped the SAT entrance requirement. They do not grade high school grade point averages comparatively. So if I get a straight A out here at a rural 500-person high school and somebody's, in Palo Alto with 2,000 people and he's got an A, it's the same. So it's a methodology not to use merit to let in students from minority backgrounds for the large part, or different types of gender or sexual identities. And what I'm getting at is that they didn't understand the consequences of that, just like the military didn't. And the consequences in the fourth year of these repertory admissions are, Yale is giving 80% A's, Stanford about 65. They've had to stop the traditional workload. They're softening the courses. They are introducing new courses. There's thousands of diversity, equity, inclusion people auditing the faculty, so they don't want to die on the altar of standards. And in this conundrum, we have, as I said, 1 million foreign students, and they're mostly from illiberal nations. There's about 150 to 200,000 from Middle Eastern Muslim nations, 350,000 from China, another 200 from right-wing or left-wing autocracies in Latin America and Asia, and we don't audit them. But the universities recruit these people because they pay full tuition with no discount, no scholarships. And so you put all of that together, and one of the subtexts of these campus demonstrations are, a lot of students feel that they want to renegotiate the university, that it's too difficult or it's too traditional, and they didn't sign up for that, and they can't do the work, and they want to be excused from their finals, they want to have their senior project dropped, et cetera, et cetera. So if you talk to employers, and I know you've seen it on the news, but you talk in person to them, they'll say, I don't want to hire these people. I don't want to hire them because I see them on television every night. They leave, they protest, they're coddled, they're hothouse plants. They want delivered food as they destroy buildings. When they leave the campus quad, it's a mess. Their trash is there. They treat policemen, maintenance people like dirt, middle-class, good Americans. If I hire them, I know they don't have the analytical skills, the English fluency or compositional skills, the mathematical background that university's preeminent degree used to signify. And I know they'll go right to human resources the moment I hire them and complain. And so you talk to these employers and they'll say, I would prefer Georgia Tech or Texas A&M or the University of Tennessee graduate to a Columbia graduate or a Yale graduate, because actually these are the new prestigious schools. We just haven't caught up. The Ivy League and American higher education, the elites are going the way of Disney and Bud Light and Target and, CNN. And they don't know it, but it's happening as we speak.
So we have generals who don't know how to recruit the right people to preserve our freedom, and we have university leadership teams that don't know how to preserve our freedom either, essentially. That's what we've got to.
Yes, we do. We have to be a college president, you have to go through the faculty ranks with one fear. You do not want to get on the wrong side of left-wing students, left-wing faculty. And they're not just Democrats, they're hard left now. And they are predominantly taken over the general education curriculum, and it's a diversity, equity, inclusion ideology. And so when you see a Claudine Gay, or you see the Columbia president, you see somebody who was promoted not on meritocratic, but on the idea that they're acceptable to the hard left and they will continue this drift. The problem they're having is that the nation had not seen this. The nation just thought, well, it's Harvard. Harvard's always Harvard. And now they've torn this scab off with these demonstrations, and they said, oh my God, these presidents have no moral compass. They're canceling graduation. They're going to Zoom classes when you pay them $90,000 per student. And they cannot say that they have an epidemic of anti-Semitism. Every time they're asked to address the issue of people pushing Jews or calling them, go back to Poland and this blatant anti-Semitism, they say, well, we deplore anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Even though there's almost no examples of Islamophobia, they have to say that because their constituency demands it. And so this is kind of a revolutionary fervor we're in these campuses. It was, to quote Hemingway's great line in The Sun Also Rises, it was gradual, like bankruptcy, and then it was sudden. It had been building up, but the Gaza war just tore the scab off. And I think people are astonished what they saw. At my university, we were looking for a new president, and everybody was assuming that we were going to have the first black woman or the first gay president, but they panicked because it's a little known fact, John, that in most of these universities, these multi-billion-dollar endowments are long-term investments and locked up. And they depend, a Stanford with 40 billion or a Harvard with 60 billion, they depend on 6 to 8 billion a year. That's what their fundraising is. And when you lose 10 or 20% of it, as some of these Ivy Leagues are experiencing, then they panic because that's the operating budget. So at Stanford, we hired the Stanford business dean, Mr. Levine, and he's very good. He's not politically correct. He's a professional. His father was president of Yale for 20 years, but he happens to be a white male. Nobody thought that would be possible, but these universities are now facing the reality that their alumni do not want to subsidize this, and they may be looking at a Republican president and Senate and House that has already said they're going to look at the tax-free endowment on the income. They're going to look at the $1.7 trillion federal subsidized loans for these kids that you see on TV. And they're going to look at these massive multi-million-dollar grants of federal monies to these universities. And so I think the universities are just now in full panic.
So that's a light at the end of the tunnel, perhaps. It's an encouraging sign. Then you're seeing things like the University of Austin, your colleague Neil Ferguson, and
Yes.
Barry Weiss, others setting that up. So if we say there's some hope emerging there, the question then is, of course, is it in time? But there's another thing that is beginning to emerge in research in both of our cultures, because if there's one thing we know now, any contagion for good or for bad spreads unbelievably quickly in the English-speaking Western part of the Western world, unbelievably quickly. We've got the same campus activity starting to emerge here. They're using the same language. Even left-wing leaders of those movements who normally hate anything American, America's the great Satan, suddenly when it comes to protesting, for example, Israel, the IDF and Israel, they're happy to say, oh, no, we're following the great lead out of America. So, they're very opportunistic. But there's another side of this that gives me some hope. I think there's a bit of a recentering going on amongst younger Western people, particularly those young men who are reacting against the overreach of the left, who have accused them of being oppressors and toxic simply because they happen to be white males. Do you see that recentering as somebody who's very conscious of what's happening on campuses in America amongst?
Yes, there's a number of
more thinking of our young people.
On my podcast, I just interviewed Jeremy Carl, who's got a best-selling book out about anti-white racism, and it's a fascinating book. He's a scholar. He's not a political activist, and he points out that this is institutionalized in the admission. So at a place like Stanford, this 2,100 are admitted, 20% are white. The demographic of the white is 67% of the white demographic. And so they're deliberately violating their old shibboleth that they were going to be that Stanford was going to look like America, that each particular demographic, 12% Black, 15% Asian and Latino, etc., were going to look like that. But they haven't. They've been repertory. So there's only been 9% white males. And he points out that we're also told that the Black population has gone to 13%, that the Native American has gone to 4%. But when you actually look at the demographics, and except for the Hispanics because of immigration, they haven't grown. What's happened is that America is a melting pot still, and people are marrying and integrating. But the difference now is 20 years ago, you went by the proportions. If you had one grandparent that was Black and 3 that were white, you identified as white. Now you identify as Black. Now you identify as Asian. So those populations are much bigger than people think. And I think the left didn't quite understand why Donald Trump is appealing, and a lot of it is to people who have, their whole families are intermarried. And they're starting to resent this anti-white backlash because they have brothers and sisters and parents that are part white or white. And so the left is in panic right now because, and you're going to see more of it this summer, because it looks like they won't be able to silence Donald Trump. And he looks like he could win if the election were held today. And if he were to win, they're projecting on what he might do. Every day there's an article or two in the Washington Post or New York Times. Donald Trump's going to be a dictator. Donald Trump's going to weaponize the FBI. And they're very eerie, the articles, because they're projections. If you read them carefully, it's almost predictable. If I were Donald Trump and I had suffered what I did to Donald Trump and I had power again, this is surely what I would do, and therefore Donald Trump must do what I would do. And I'm not sure he's going to do that at all, but they're afraid that he would take vengeance on them the way that they really have the last 4 years on people on the right.
Just on the election again for a moment, why is it that successful state governors like Ron DeSantis, but others, Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, and for that matter, he didn't even nominate, of course, but Mike Pompeo, a very impressive individual, it seems, as from an outsider looking in, couldn't pack out a hall anywhere in the way that President Trump could. What's behind that? I mean, if you take DeSantis, plainly many Americans believe that he has been a highly successful governor. And if we go back to our earlier remarks about federalism and his state appearing to be the sort of place that would appeal to a lot of more conservative people, but it didn't translate into any support, any sort of rear view mirror views.
Yeah, I think we're partly back to 2016 when we had a very capable field of Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and Scott Walker, all proven executive senators, and the same phenomenon happens. And so we had a very photogenic, charismatic Nikki Haley. We had a very sober, judicious, and effective governor, Ron DeSantis. But I think the problem was that they thought the MAGA agenda, which they supported, was separate. They were making the argument that you could get closed borders, a strong defense budget, but you didn't have to get Donald Trump in the bargain. You could get a person who didn't tweet, who didn't use capital letters, who wasn't crude and vulgar. And the Republican base, or the Republican Party in general, said, no, that's not true. We're at a stage in this country where we need a pit bull and we want to cut the leash and unleash him, because traditional Republican candidates who are arguing they're going to be much more effective just the way they were in their own states and in their own prior governance, we don't believe that's true. They don't have the buoyant, outgoing, never give a damn personality at this moment that's needed. And whatever they thought about Trump is that he will fight. He will fight to the death, the left, and he will stop this revolution. I think myself that Haley and DeSantis, to take two examples, would have been the same, but what I think doesn't matter. It's what I know, what most people that I talk to and I read about thought. And Donald Trump, they felt, had 4 years of governance that in every aspect were superior to Joe Biden's and could be easily replicated again. And more importantly, that when push came to shove, Donald Trump would try to stop illegal immigration. And Donald Trump would try to be tough with the Chinese, and Donald Trump would not be ambiguous about Israel in a way that maybe the other ones, I think they would have done the same, but they were part of the uniparty establishment. That was what I detected the voters thought, and that Donald Trump was a complete outsider. And we talked about that before. He was a gunslinger who came into town and cleaned things up, and he wasn't part of the town's city council. And that's what they wanted in 2016. They did not want it particularly in 2020. But they do again now because they've seen what happened in the interval, and they don't like the Biden 4 years, and they're saying to everybody, we've got to clean this up. The other thing is, I think very quickly, we concentrate on the crudity of Donald Trump, but if you are in a room with Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley and Donald Trump and other candidates that were on that stage, and you wanted to know who would be the funniest and the most at ease and the most authentic, they would probably tell you that Donald Trump was. They would like everybody else, but Donald Trump, he doesn't care. That's what they want right now. He doesn't care. Most people say, oh my God, I cannot go to jail, or oh my God, I've been indicted, or oh my God, I got a porno star after me. It'll ruin my reputation. He doesn't care. And the people now have that same attitude. They got to the point where they don't care. And they tell you that. And we'll see. I don't think the judges, the prosecutors, and the juries understand that the more they go after him, the more he's gaining support from people who also don't care. And they're so angry. And a lot of them are in the black male community, the Latino. I live in a community of 95%, and my wife and I, we interact with all of our friends, and we have not met a Hispanic, Mexican-American male over the age of 40 who's voting for Joe Biden.
So you're actually practicing inclusiveness where you live, are you, Victor?
Yes. I've seen young Hispanic women. I've seen mature Hispanic women that will probably vote traditionally Democratic, but not the males. They don't want, there's so many issues that they have problems with the left. And it's a very revolutionary, explosive development. And the left is a revolutionary. This Democratic Party is a Jacobin party, and they will not change their ideology or their agenda. It's run by the Obamas and the people in the Obama administration who feel that they missed the boat and they were too compromised to be reelected or whatever. And Joe Biden is expendable. They don't care about Joe Biden. He's an empty vessel. And he's a very useful veneer to push this unpopular but revolutionary agenda forward and get it institutionalized.
So a couple of things arise out of what you've just said. First, the perception of Americans that Trump actually was a more successful president than Biden. A CNN, of all places, a CNN poll has revealed that most Americans believe that Trump was a better president. He was a success, and Biden is a failure. In direct distinction, I suppose, from the elites in the media who can't come to grips with that. That's what ordinary Americans think, and even CNN had to acknowledge it. That's a pretty extraordinary state of affairs.
Well, we've never seen this before. We've had a ex-president run against a president in 1912 with Teddy Roosevelt trying to unseat Taft, but they were the same party, and there were two records that they could compare. But we've never had an ex-president that has a 4-year record from a very different political point of view versus what will be a 4-year record. So when people are looking at the price of gasoline, the price of eggs and meat, and mortgages and insurance, car insurance and cars themselves, all the staple things. And they look at the Trump 4 years, the Biden 4 years. They look at, was there a war in Gaza? Was there a war in Ukraine? Was there a humiliation in Afghanistan? Did the Chinese threaten daily Taiwan? Did North Korea start to threaten people again? Was there a Chinese balloon? No. They can see that. Was there greater or less racial tension? Were the campuses this ideologically? Was there so much anti-Semitism? Was it worse or better? Was Israel stronger or weaker under Biden or Trump? And they've come to the conclusion, and and they know this because although they won't change course, what the Biden people are doing is they're saying, we want to replace fossil fuels, but privately, we've drained the strategic petroleum reserve to dangerous levels. We're jawboning the Saudis to pump more. We're secretly opening leases, and we've got almost as much gas and oil as during the Trump peak. And we're now asking Mexico, you're afraid, Mr. Obrador, as we are, of Donald Trump, so why don't just for the summer you clamp down on the security a little bit and not let people in? So they know that their agenda has been injurious to people, but they won't change it, but they want to airbrush it. And that's not going to work. They call it Bidenomics, and they've even dropped that term. They don't use it anymore. It's been a disaster on the deficit, the long-term debt, the inflation, the border, the 10 million illegal aliens, the campuses, the foreign policy, the crime that's gone up, and then the sense that the commander-in-chief is physically and mentally, cognitively challenged and is not up to the job. And that's an issue that the voters think is not necessarily age-related, because apparently they think Donald Trump, who's only 2 years younger, would have no problem. And I think they're probably right about that, being commander-in-chief again.
It does raise the issue of the vice president candidate for beside President Biden. One assumes that Donald Trump, and you mentioned it, that sense of humor, which you can use it pretty effectively. He presumably will run the line that a vote for President Biden is a vote for president, I suppose, Kamala Harris. How would that play out?
Well, there's been a lot of scenarios, and I guess the fear of the Democratic donor class is that Joe Biden is hemorrhaging, and they're looking for ways that bloodletting would be staunched. And they say to themselves, is the economy going to recover? And of course, there's people talking about a severe recession, or worse, a stagflation, as we keep printing, $1 trillion every 100 days to spur the economy. And people are saying, well, we don't have a lot of tools to control this, because we've had inflation that's not going to end. And then they're looking at, is this war in Gaza or Ukraine going to finish? No. Is China going to back off a little bit? No. Is the border going to be closed? And no. And so they're looking at this Chicago convention in August, and they're afraid it might be like 1968, where people went home from campus in 68, and everybody said, well, they're Democrats, they're leftists, schools are out, it's quiet. It was pretty quiet. And then suddenly they came out of the woodwork and destroyed Hubert Humphrey at the 68 convention. And nobody thought Richard Nixon could win after his earlier defeat in 1960. And he gave Nixon the election. So they look at all this, and then they say, but we can't get rid of Kamala Harris because that's not who we are. We don't get rid of black women in backdoor deals. So people have suggested, if this bloodletting continues, sometime in August, the Biden people would release the delegates, and then they would have a genuinely open convention, and they could say to Kamala Harris, we want you to win, but you've got to win the delegates. And from what we understand, she'd win no delegates. And it would be somebody like a Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, or Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, or Gavin Newsom, or someone like that. And they feel that even at that late date, they might have a chance to stop Donald Trump. So people are talking about that all the time. But they're very, very worried that at some point, and we've got a long way to go to the election and even to the convention. So people are very, very worried that something could happen to Joe Biden, that he is an inadvertent step away from one step off Air Force One into falling, or one slip of the tongue of saying something so outrageous that it would be career ending, because he can say almost anything to anyone, anytime, anywhere, and we would have her inherit the presidency, step up to the presidency, and then go into the election as the incumbent. So all of these are scenarios that I think imperil the Democrats more than they do the Republicans.
Again, out of your earlier comments, we've got a radically changed America. Middle-class Americans now apparently identifying as essentially, there's no other putting it. We've got the same thing in Australia, anti-Semitic. It's hard to imagine where this came from. If they'd been taught their history, if they really understood the Holocaust, they'd hardly claim that the Jewish people were oppressors. I can't think of a race of people who have been more oppressed down through history. But here we have it. So the attitude towards Israel, firstly, someone commented to me recently that Jewish people are starting to think that Biden is the last Democrat president on the current trajectories who's likely to be a supporter of Israel. That's a chilling prospect. But America's moved to the point where the majority of Americans are not perhaps prepared to, in the future, secure or be committed to the idea of a home state for the Jewish people.
Your qualifier was very important, last Democratic president, because if you look at the polls, the nation at large is about 65 to 70%, depending on how the question is posed, pro-Israel. When you break that support down, Republican, Democrat, the Republican support is higher than the national average. It's up to 80%, 90%. When you look at the Democratic, it goes down below 50% for the first time. And so Joe Biden reflects that reality. He understands that the nation itself supports Israel, and especially his opponents. And there's 6 million Jewish Americans, and 4 million can vote, and they are overrepresented as the donor class. 70% vote Democratic. And Joe Biden then understands where the nation is at, and he understands where a lot of his strongest supporters are at, but he sees that the Democratic Party is evaporating. It doesn't really exist as it used to on issues like transgenderism or DEI or ESG, etc. And the people leading the Democratic Party are the radical BLM, Antifa, the Squad, the Black Caucus, all of these very radical groups. So the result of how that manifests itself, if I'm Joe Biden and there are Jewish students this week beaten up or locked in a library, or people are shouting, "Go back to Poland," I say, I deplore all violence. On the one hand, I do not want to see any more anti-Semitism, and I don't want to see any more Islamophobia. But there's no Islamophobia. There's almost non-existent on these campuses. The people who are expressing the anti-Semitism are primarily, not exclusively, but the leaders of that group are from the Middle East. So when people look at this, they said, "Oh my God, this is Orwellian. We've got all these students from the Middle East, and they are the most prominent in all the demonstrations, and they are yelling, 'We are Hamas, we love Hezbollah, death to America, death to Israel,' and Joe Biden is suggesting they're suffering from Islamophobia? This is absurd." And so then he's hemorrhaging more as much with the Jewish vote and people who sympathize with Israel in the Democratic Party and the independents as he is with the young people. If I were Joe Biden, I would write off the 250,000 voters who are Arab, American, or Muslim. I don't mean write them off and offend them, but I would try to maintain my party's support for Israel because there are more Jewish voters, there's more donor money, and there's more independent voters that sympathize. And when you look at November, if all of these kids on campus say, we're going to sit out in Michigan, well, they better be very careful, because if they lose Michigan and Donald Trump is elected, one of the things he said he's going to do is do what he did last time and issue a travel ban, not on Muslim or Arab countries, but on countries he feels are dangerous and you cannot trust their home immigration authorities to vet their immigrants coming into here. So Somalia, North Korea, Iran, and Gaza, and the West Bank, and Syria, and Iraq, those students, many of them wouldn't be here. So I can't imagine that they're going to vote for that. But by not voting for Biden, they will be voting for that. So the dilemma's on them. They think they're putting everybody in a dilemma. I would say to them, stay home if you want. And that will ensure that Michigan goes to Donald Trump. And while he won't target you, he will say your home country that you now romanticize and you praise to the skies, but under no circumstances do you want to go back there. You're going to have to go back there. And then I think we haven't even talked about, among this legislation to reform the campuses, there's a big move in the Republican Senate to question the promiscuous use of the student visa. Do we really want to let these universities determine our own immigration policies? When you have a Middle Eastern Lebanese lecturer at George Washington, and when you have an African-American Republican Congressman, Byron Donalds, come on campus 2 days ago and he says, you're an Uncle Tom, you're a race traitor, you're a bastard. Is that the type of, are we so short of talented faculty in the United States we have to import people like that? And the same goes to these students. We have enough problems without having some student come and praise Hamas to the skies. I don't think they add much to the American mosaic. And I think, so I don't understand where they think their leverage is. They think they have all this leverage. They only have leverage in the tiny little atmosphere of the campus, only because they have timid college president. The college presidents really have all the leverage. All it would need is, one of them in these left-wing elite campuses could say, you're going to break up the camp. If you don't do it, we're going to arrest you. If you're arrested, you're going to lose your student visa because we're going to suspend you. And if you lose your student visa, you're going to have to go back where you came from. And they're either afraid of the loss of revenue or they're afraid that they would offend people, but they have enormous clout if they want to use it.
You mentioned, and it's happening here too, every time they talk, our leaders, because we have, on this issue, very weak leadership in Australia at the moment. I can't believe how weak it is because it's threatening social cohesion. And every time they do it, they feebly bring themselves to say, there's no place for anti-Semitism in Australia. Well, they can't say it. There's no place for anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. Now, the man in the street watching all this, they're not mugs. This is the point you often make. You say that you believe in an America that's good for people who don't have degrees as much as it is for the elites who do and are so condescending. Here's another example, I think, of their blindness. The man in the street must be looking at this, and I feel this. I mean, I've been a political practitioner for a lot of my life, and they're saying, this doesn't add up. I have no reason to fear the Jews. Bit of a phobia is fear. I'm beginning to think maybe I do have reason to fear Islamic beliefs and fundamentalism. In fact, the attempt to dismiss it, to discount it, to somehow say it's not there, ignores the reality that the way many of these people are pro-Hamas demonstrators, who are apologists for Hamas, people who won't state the obvious, it's Hamas who caused this and Hamas who can bring about a ceasefire, the person in the street's beginning to say, well, What do we make of Islamic belief and the way in which it seems to give rise to particularly ugly practices?
Yeah, I think the same is true here. I think Americans say, they put on their one hand, they say, who was occupying the Golden Gate Bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, who stormed into St. Patrick's Cathedral and disrupted Christian services, who disrupted the Christmas services, who was calling for death to America, who was calling for the final solution, who's yelling these terrible things, go back to Poland, who's using violence on campus, who's storming camp, and they don't see Jewish students. When you see and I'm on a campus, when you see the pro-Israel protesters, they're very law-abiding, they get a permit, they have their American and Israel flags, and they're not law-breaking, and they're not violent. And so one side is doing this, and a lot of people say to themselves, we don't really need this. We don't really do this. And then when they get into the issue of Gaza, the average American, it's reflected in this 75 to 85% support for Israel, says, well, there was a ceasefire. It was called October 6th. Somebody broke the ceasefire, and that was not Israel. And they murdered 1,200 innocent civilians. Hamas did. Civilians accompanied their way in to the kibbutzes to help out. They launched 7,000 rockets at Jewish civilians. And so they wanted to be disproportionate, but they were incompetent, and Israel was disproportionate and competent. But their intent was to be just as disproportionate as anybody. And so when you actually look at now what is going to happen, people are saying, well, it would be very easy to solve. You just go to the Gaza Hamas leadership and you say to them, give us a list of all of the hostages, all 130 plus if they are alive, and release them, and then simply turn over all the architects of October 7th that participated or planned it, and we'll have a ceasefire. And they won't do that. And everybody knows why they won't do it, because the people they're negotiating with are the same people who planned October 7th, and they don't want to give a list of the hostages because they've murdered a lot of them. And so Israel's got no choice but to go in, and I think they'll wait till the campuses are empty. They'll go in and they will destroy Hamas. And I don't think there's going to be a lot of people in the Western world who are going to be angry about that. They'll cry crocodile tears. They'll say the IDF was inconsiderate of collateral damage, which is not true. But at the end, there will be no Hamas if you let the IDF do it. And I think that's what's going to happen sometime in June.
So you feel that Hamas can be defeated militarily, scrubbed out. I share your view that the Israelis are certainly capable of it. But unfortunately, a bigger question remains, given that Hamas, let's face it, unbelievably have been winning the public relations war. I mean, I find that staggering, but they have been. And people need to stop and think about that. You're letting a people who have written into their constitution the idea of the genocide, written into it. They're open about it. They don't even try and hide it like the Nazis did. But they've been winning the propaganda war in the West. Can the Israelis win the propaganda war?
If you want to look where the real crescendo of there was 3 stages here in America to the campus protests, and people forget that. The first stage was smaller but very virulent, and it happened on October 7th. Here where I work, we had a professor that separated Jews from non-Jews in his class to celebrate, made them sit on one side. A Cornell professor said he was exhilarated. There were a lot of, what I'm getting at is the protests were primarily Middle Eastern students, and they were celebratory, bragging about it. The IDF went in 20 days later on October 27th. At first, there was not a lot of protests because they simply swept through and humiliated Hamas. When they started to bend to pressure from the West, Europe, Britain, us, that they had to go slower, that they had to be careful, they had to drop leaflets, which is all good. they slowed down, and there was a sense that Hamas was going to survive. When they stopped, when the Biden administration told Netanyahu to stop, then that fueled the fire, because these people felt that they were successful. And they said, everybody's listening to us. And more people who had no ideology at all and were completely ignorant, mostly American students, they rushed out and said, this is like our parents told us. It's working. We're taking over the campus. But had Joe Biden said in mid-October, the IDF did not start this war. They avoid fewer casualties than we did in Mosul and Fallujah. For Israel to survive, they have to destroy Hamas. Hamas, give up the architects of the massacre, give back the hostages, or I can't guarantee what Israel will do. And if they had have said to Iran, you're welcome to hit Israel if that's what you want to do, but there are absolutely no restraints on our part on a retaliatory aid. And we will try to help Israel shoot down as we did. And your huge barrage of 320 planned missiles will fail, and their smaller barrage will succeed. If we had just had that attitude, I think Israel there wouldn't have been a Hamas by now. Israel would have been seen as successful. Its Arab friends, the Gulf states, Jordan and Egypt, would have privately been ecstatic because Hamas would have been gone. And the Middle Eastern students wouldn't have to carry the extra burden. They were losers, that their cause lost. But now they think their cause is ascendant and they're beating the West. And that was all because of Joe Biden. And had he just kept what he said he was going to do on October 8th, we wouldn't be in this dilemma right now.
Well, that leads us to the title of your latest book, which is The End of Everything, How Wars Descend Into Annihilation. As we come to it, it's the story of just how horrendous the human species, the horrendous sort of state it can take itself to, if I can put it that way. Is it possible, just before we come to the book in a bit more detail, that Israel could actually be annihilated? I mean, you've got Iran, you've got Hamas,
yeah, it's very possible.
We've had
20 years ago, Mr. Rafsanjani purportedly said that Israel was a one-bomb state, and then subsequent Iranian leaders have said they like the idea of a Jewish state as the home for the observant Jews in the world, and the idea that half the Jews who are actually Jewish in the sense that they're observant Jews are now in one place, and that made their extinction easier with a nuclear weapon. And we have the methodology is accelerated. We have bioweapons, as we saw, not that it was a bioweapon, but we can saw what COVID did. We know about nerve agents, we have atomic weapons, and we have AI. So the methods of destruction have accelerated at a vast rate. So there are places in the world where we have vulnerable small nations in very rough neighborhoods with people who have promised to not just defeat them, but annihilate them, erase them. So to give a couple of quick examples, the Chinese government on a number of occasions says that Taiwan doesn't exist. It was a historical mistake. It can be rectified by destroying Taiwan or absorbing it. I wrote one line in the book about that, in the epilogue, about examples, and the Chinese publisher ordered me to take it out or he would cancel this massive buy of Chinese translations. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't take it out. So they canceled the entire book. And you can see they're very sensitive to that. Mr. Erdogan in Turkey has threatened to send missiles into downtown Athens and wipe it out. He said to the Armenians that just Karabakh, they had 200,000 Armenians in Azerbaijan were ethnically cleansed and forced back into tiny Armenia, just 3 million people. And he said that he had a solution for them. And it was a solution of his grandparents, meaning the Turkish genocide. We've had about 15 people in the Russian parliament, media, and military say they would like to destroy Ukraine in the sense that they wanted to absorb it, get rid of the Ukrainian language, and put it back where it belonged as a Russian state. And so it's very common to see, and I'm not even getting into what the crazy things Kim Jong-un has yelled, but what's eerie about this is very rare to destroy a Carthage or a Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, or a Constantinople, but it happens. And what I was trying to show in the book is that it happens because people think it's impossible to happen. So in all the cases I just delineated, John, the action has been, that's just silly. They would never do it. Russians are just bluffing. They would never use a tactical nuclear weapon, much less a strategic. Erdogan just letting off steam. He would never try to destroy 3 million Armenians. And the Iranians would know that they can't get away with that. And you say to them, well, the Iranians would be famous Persian Shia. They would inherit the mantle of Islam as the one entity that destroyed the Jewish state. They might want to lose half their population to try it. Oh, no, they would never do that. And that was what all of these ancient examples that I pointed out in the book is they all said it couldn't happen here. Alexander the Great wouldn't dare do it. Scipio, he's an intellectual, he would not do it. Cortez, he's met Montezuma, he would not do it. Mehmet has the largest library in Islam, he's an intellectual, he would not destroy Constantinople. Or they said, we can count on the Genovese fleet, it'll be in the Dardanelles very quickly, it'll save us at the last moment, or a Macedonian army will come to the rear of the Roman besiegers at Carthage, or the Athenians, the Spartans, they'll come and help us defeat Alexander. It never happened. And so, yeah, I think that there's a template or a paradigm when I looked at this that shows you that countries that think that there's preeminent because they were, and they're not honest about decline. They don't take a dispassionate inventory of their defenses and resources vis-a-vis their attacker, but they live on past dreams. We're the great Byzantine Empire of 20 million people, or we're ancient Thebes, the home of Oedipus and Antigone, or we're Carthage, where Hannibal was at the gates of Rome almost, or we're Mexico City that has an empire of 4 million. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that we won World War I or we won World War II or we've created the post-war order. All that matters right now is how many assets, financial, cultural, political, and especially military do you have, and can you deter an enemy? And if you can't, you got to be very careful.
Well, the book, and you've had, as the New York Times has noted, 2 previous bestsellers, The Dying Citizen, The Case for Trump. Andrew Roberts, author of Churchill, which is, certainly an acclaimed book, and he's a very acclaimed writer. He said, readers will be shocked quite how often total military, cultural, and societal exploitation happens in our species' stories. We need to learn from this groundbreaking book how to stop it happening to us. Plainly, you had reasons for writing it because, what we've been talking about is pretty grim stuff. But you and I are talking because we actually don't want grim things to happen. We want to turn things around.
Yes.
We're about a positive agenda. So you've written it for positive reasons, but it's a grim book. Why? Why is it so important?
Well, the book was finished before the recent developments with Iran back and forth with Israel and Gaza. So I wasn't sure that it would be relevant in a topical sense, but I wanted to point out that the very rare in history happens, and the people that it happens to don't believe it will happen to them. And the people who are conquering them are not Genghis Khan or Tamerlane or Attila the Hun that come in, sweep through a civilization, murder people, and move on. They are intellectuals. They're very capable people. They're very well-read. They're very articulate. Alexander the Great, student of Aristotle, companion of the philosopher Callisthenes, when he said to the Thebans, I will be down there in 300 miles, I will be down there in 10 days, and if you don't, and I wipe your city out, they didn't think that was imaginable. The city was 1,100 years old. Or when Scipio came, they said, we fought the Romans twice, and we always had an agreement after we lost. And we remember Scipio Africanus, your adopted grandfather, and he was he gave us terms, and we're the city of Hannibal. And they didn't understand Scipio Aemilianus was a killer, and he was going to destroy everything that was Carthage, down to the foundations of the city. And when Constantine XI was dealing with Mehmet, he sent him a letter, and he said, "You're only 21 years old, and we've been here for 1,100 years, and we're very valuable to Islam. We're the window on the West. You can buy cannon, you can get expertise with your concessions inside the walls of Constantinople." And Mehmet basically said, "You've only got about 50 or 60,000 people. You're not the Byzantine Empire of the past. And I don't want to hear anything you have to say." And the same thing, I could go to the same argument. What I'm getting at is they had no imagination how weak they were and what the actual intent of their enemies are. And when you look at the real world and you ask yourself, if President Xi really wanted to take Taiwan, would he be willing to destroy it, to take it, to get rid of it? Everybody says, well, he wouldn't do that because of the chip industry, or he would lose too much. But could he be stopped without a nuclear exchange? I don't think he could, myself, given the military right now. I think he could be in 5 years if we rearmed. I think if Ukraine, everybody thinks the Ukraine thing is static, but to win that war, the only way Ukraine can get Russia off its back is to follow traditional military logic, and that would probably be to hit Russian supply depots, oil refineries along the border to interrupt their invasion. But to do that would, I think, invite a response from Putin that would be very unpredictable. And I don't think he would care at all if he could level Kiev and get away with it. So, and I don't need to talk about Turkey. Turkey is a member of NATO, but if you came from another planet and you looked at what Turkey has said and done, it's supplying Russia with weapons. It can't be trusted with NATO arms. During the coup 6 years ago in Turkey, Mr. Erdogan let it be known that our Cold War huge dirty bombs, I think we have 50 nuclear weapons at Isilar. He said he didn't think that they were properly the property of the United States. They'd been there so long to protect Turkey that he felt that they were Turkish, and he didn't want them removed. And I know there are people in the U.S. military that feel they have to remove them, whether stealthily or one by one, because they don't feel they're in a safe place. That tomorrow, if there was a conflagration between Greece and Turkey, or Armenia and Turkey, or the Kurds and Turkey, that base could be surrounded and the weapons could be appropriated. And all of this is dependent on a West that can't deter people. And we think we've been here so long and we've run the show so long that that's just unthinkable. All the inventions, all the technology, all the universities, they're all Western, and therefore the world needs us. I don't think that's necessarily true. And so I wouldn't worry if today the English-speaking countries were armed to the teeth. They were spending 3 to 4% GDP. They had sophisticated anti-missile protection over like the Iron Dome. They had both nuclear and tactical capabilities. They had Churchillian-like leaders, and then they weren't suffering from this fertility crisis, and debt crisis. But I don't see that in the world today, so I'm very, very worried that something terrible could happen. I don't think it's likely, but I think it could happen.
Actually, in the book, you describe some pretty horrific torture and death in your book, mainly by quoting historic eyewitnesses. The Carthaginians torturing and killing torturing and killing Romans, human sacrifice by both those people and most notoriously the Aztecs. Since you wrote this book, as you just said, of course, we've seen brutality that must match even those horrendous examples in your book. with the slaughtering of and raping and just sheer unbelievable cruelty by Hamas in their successful attempt, I suppose you'd say, to provoke what's now happened. It's a powerful reminder to very, very, very soft generations in the West who have lived in the peace and security secured by our own forebears that human nature hasn't changed. And you wonder whether we haven't inculcated in ourselves such a naivety, such a sort of an innocence, such a hopeless failure to recognise just how cruel we actually can be when we're debased. And that ought to be a massive warning in itself. People ought to be genuinely afraid of what might happen to themselves, to their children, to their loved ones, if we're not prepared to say freedom matters, law and order matters. We've got to stand up so that we can secure the things we have, but we seem so blinded.
The veneer of civilization, as Thucydides said, is always very thin because human nature is unchanging. So when I wrote collated from the historian Appian and parts of Livy, that gruesome scene on the walls were to get the attention of the Romans. They cut off the ears and disemboweled, cut up, and mutilated these Roman soldiers and then threw them from the walls. I was kind of shocked. There's a lot of barbarity in the ancient world, but that was one of the most graphic scenes. And I'd known of the scene for some years, but when I read and I looked at some of the videos from Hamas, two things struck me. One, I had never seen in the modern world that level of mutilation or gang rape or sickness, putting a child in a microwave, for example. And I'd never seen such indifference to it. So here we are 8 months later, and the people on the campus don't even mention it. And not only do they not mention it, they were cheering it on after it happened. As I said, a number of professors have been put on leave, professors, not students, for saying things like they were exhilarated. And this was the beginning of the Free Palestine movement. And so we're always just a hair's breadth from what we really are, which is pretty savage without civilization. That's why it's very important when we watch these campus things that you put a high premium on having a clean campus. You have a high premium that nobody breaks in and destroys books or overturns chairs or defecates in a classroom floor. If you don't do that, each insidious assault on civilization takes away that veneer. And it can happen very quickly. And that's why I think what was so shocking about the demonstrations were not just the ideology, but the manner in which they treated people. They went right back to they were like the black shirts of the 1930s in Germany, where they just started roughing people up and nobody said a word. Or they were like the anarchist of where they just destroyed things. And one of the most disturbing pictures that I saw was the UCLA campus when they were forced out. It was unimaginable, the flotsam and jetsam that was left. It was almost disgraceful. And then you had these Mexican-American dutiful maintenance people that had to deal with human excrement and needles. It was just horrific. And these were our future leaders, the elite. No one had even said anything about it. No college president said, you've done millions of dollars of damage to our infrastructure and you're going to pay for it. So the veneer of civilization can be erased very quickly. And then what's beneath it is pretty scary. And so, when Iran was talking about sending its 320 cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones, they were talking, that was the largest barrage in missile attacks since World War II from V2 rockets. We've never seen that many. And people forget that the intent was not measured. Anthony Blinken said, if you want to attack, you have to do it within limits. They didn't do it within limits. The idea was to swarm the defenses with drones and cruise missiles, and then have the 120 ballistic missiles do some real damage. And that's nobody said anything after. They just shrugged. I think we don't even realize now that has opened a new chapter. We know now that the Israeli homeland and the Iranian homeland are not sacrosanct. That it's okay to attack it, or vice versa, given Iran's attack on the homeland of Israel. And I expect in the years to follow, months to follow, weeks to follow, that there's going to be some very scary things go on. That I don't think there'll be a second Holocaust. I just don't think there will be a second Holocaust. I think if Israel decides that Iran has the bomb, and they will conclude that they will use it, and they have good reason to believe that, and they will not allow that to be used. And that's going to be something that no one can imagine what would happen in a nuclear exchange. And yet we don't seem to. I mean, we're talking about a situation as we speak that the major maritime corridors of commerce and communications and trade are shutting down. The Red Sea is inoperable now thanks to the Houthis. The Black Sea is a war zone. The Straits of Hormuz, Iran is hijacking ships. The eastern coast of the Mediterranean is iffy, and they've talked about attacking the Suez Canal. And so this is very insidious, and I don't think that we're kind of decivilizing both at home and abroad. We don't quite see it. This new axis of Russia, Iran, China, North Korea. If countries like Qatar or Turkey or India think it's on the ascendance, then they may want to passively or covertly aid it. And if they think we're in the descendants, their attitude is, well, I don't want to be bullied by Russia or China and have a ambivalent America that can't protect me, or I don't know whether I'm under its nuclear shield or not. So I have to make the necessary adjustment. And then the world gets very scary. And so I think I wrote the book with that in mind, but I didn't have any idea that it would crystallize as it did on October 7th.
Well, Victor, once again, you've been very generous with your time and enormously sobering. And I think the one thing we can both agree on is that it need not be this way. We still have essentially the institutions of freedom that can be resurrected if people, by leaders of the right caliber, if American citizenship can be restored, Australian citizenship can be restored. It need not end in a mess. But the time is late in the day, and we need to wake up. That's surely the rallying call.
I would think that if the Western countries get a hold of their immigration policies, secure their borders, get their financial house in order, and rearm, and stick together, because they'll hang separately if they don't. They've always been the most formidable force in the world, but you open the border and you have no idea who's coming into your country or what their intent is, and you borrow or print money so it's almost worthless, and then you disarm why autocratic governments like China and Russia are rearming and are candid about what their objectives are. It's not good. But you're absolutely right. We have the West has the knowledge, it has the technology, it has the money, it has the skill more than any other area in the world. It just has to unify and regain that confidence.
So it needs to be repulsed by the stories you tell about what humanity is capable of. It needs to believe in itself, and it needs to make the necessary investments in those beliefs. It's not too late, but if we tarry much longer, it may be.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I was in Israel last summer, and to see a most beautiful city like Haifa, I've been to Haifa before, but if you go to Haifa today, it's a huge port. The streets are immaculate. It's the center of the Baha'i faith. The Israelis have hosted it. The cafes are open. you can do things in Haifa you could not do in an American city. It's completely crime-free. There's not very much of a homeless problem. And the idea that Iran wanted to obliterate that city is just mind-boggling. And they would have had there had not been a defensive system like Iron Dome or the United States and France and Britain helping to knock down drones. So that what I'm getting at is that achievement in civilization is remarkable from where it came from just 60 years ago, but it could be wiped out tomorrow if people are not good custodians.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you, John.